Hello and welcome to today's ACM Learning webinar. This webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and serving the over 100,000 computing professionals and students who are ACM members. My name is Gregory Piatetsky-Shapiro. I'm editor and publisher of KD Nuggets, a leading resource for business analytics, big data, data mining, and data science. I'm also founder of Knowledge Discovery and Database Conferences and co-founder of ACM SIGKDD Group, the leading professional organization for knowledge discovery and data mining. You can read more about me on KD Nuggets or in the bio widget on the left side of your screen. So today's talk would be 5 Tribes of Machine Learning and What You Can Take From Each by Pedro Domingos. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with ACM or what it has to offer, ACM recognizes the role of computing in driving the innovations that sustain competitiveness in a global environment. You can see some of the highlights on your screen, which include the Learning Center tools, popular publications, ACM Digital Library, international conferences, including ACM SIGKDD, prestigious awards like the Turing Award, and much more. Some housekeeping. First, the Twitter hashtag is ACM Learning. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. On the bottom panel, you'll find a number of widgets and resources. If you're experiencing problems with slides or audio, press F5 key in Windows, Command R if you're on a Mac, or refresh your browser on a mobile device, or close and relaunch the presentation. To control volume, adjust the master volume on your computer. At the end of our presentation, we'll have time for questions. We expect over 1,000 people, so there would be a lot of questions, hopefully many interesting. Please type your question into Q&A box at any time and click on the Submit button. This session is being recorded and will be archived. You'll receive automatic email notification when it is available, and check learning.acm.org in a few days for updates. You can also use Facebook and Twitter widgets on bottom panel to share the presentation link with your friends and tweet comments and questions using the hashtag ACM Learning. We'll be watching for your tweets. Again, today's presentation is The 5 Tribes of Machine Learning and What You Can Take From Each by Professor Pedro Domingos.
Thanks, Gregory, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar. Let me start with a very simple question. Where does knowledge come from? Until very recently, it came from 3 sources. Evolution, that's the knowledge that's encoded in your DNA. Experience, the knowledge that's encoded in your synapses. And culture, the knowledge that you acquire by talking with other people, reading books, and so on. But recently, there's a new source of knowledge on the planet, computers. And this is going to be a change in every way, I think, as momentous as the changes that the previous 3 represented. Notice that evolution is, it's what created all life on Earth. The experience is what, distinguishes mammals from insects. And culture is what makes human beings so successful. Also, every one of these sources of knowledge works orders of magnitude faster than the previous ones and produces orders of magnitude more knowledge. And computers, in that regard, are going to be no exception. In fact, Yann LeCun, the director of AI research at Facebook, says that most of the knowledge in the world in the future is going to be extracted by machines and will reside in machines. So, how do computers discover new knowledge? Well, there are 5 main ways, and that's what most of this webinar is going to cover. The first main way is to fill in gaps in existing knowledge, much like scientists do when they work. Formulate hypotheses, check them against data, see what's missing, see what's wrong, refine them, and so on. The second one is to emulate the brain. right? The brain is the greatest, learning machine on earth, and so maybe we can try to emulate it on a computer. The third one is to simulate evolution, right? In some ways, evolution is an even greater learning algorithm than the brain, since it produces the brain as well as, everything, all of you and all of life on earth. The fourth one is to realize that all knowledge that is learned from data is necessarily uncertain. So what we need to do is to explicitly deal with that uncertainty using probability, and then systematically update the uncertainty or how much we believe in each hypothesis as we get more data. And finally, perhaps the simplest of all of them is to learn just by noticing similarities between the new situation that you're in and old situations that you've been in before, and then try to apply things from one in the other. And associated with each of these ways of discovering new knowledge, there's a major school of thought in machine learning. And it's quite fascinating. So, on the one hand, machine learning, I think, is very important because of all the impact that it's having in the world. But it's also a very fascinating field because each of these tribes, each of these paradigms, has its origins in a different field of science. So, for example, the first tribe, the symbolists, they're the ones who sort of like do knowledge discovery by filling in the gaps in your knowledge. Their origins are in logic, philosophy. They're the most computer sciencey of the five tribes, if you will. Each of these tribes has its own master algorithm, meaning a general purpose learner that can, in principle, learn anything from data. In the case of the symbolists, their master algorithm is inverse deduction, and we'll see in just a second what it is. Then there are the connectionists. These are the people who want to reverse engineer the brain, or at least be inspired by it. Their roots are, of course, in neuroscience, and their master algorithm is backpropagation. Very popular these days. The evolutionaries, they have their roots in evolutionary biology, and their master algorithm is genetic programming. Bayesians have their roots in statistics, and their master algorithm is probabilistic inference using a Bayes theorem. Finally, the analogizers, they actually have roots in a lot of different fields, but perhaps the most important one is psychology, and their best known algorithm is kernel machines, also known as support vector machines. So let's look at what each of these tribes is and what its master algorithm does and how it works. And then at the end, we will try to pull back and try to synthesize all of this and also see what some of the consequences of it are. So let's start with the symbolists. So here are three of the most prominent symbolists in the world. There's Tom Mitchell at Carnegie Mellon, Steve Muggleton in the UK, and Ross Quinlan in Australia. And the most basic idea in symbolic machine learning is to view induction as the inverse of deduction, right? So learning is induction. Induction is going from specific facts to general rules, and you can view that as the inverse of deduction, which is going from general rules to specific facts. In much the same way that subtraction is the inverse of addition, or integration is the inverse of differentiation, and so on. So, for example, addition answers the question, if I add 2 and 2, what do I get? The answer, of course, being 4. Subtraction answers the inverse question, which is, what do I need to add to 2 in order to get 4? In close analogy with that, deduction allows us to answer a question like, if I know that Socrates is human and humans are mortal, what follows from that? What follows, of course, that Socrates himself is mortal. Induction now answers the inverse question, which is, if I know that Socrates is human and I also know that he's mortal, right? What do I need? What else do I need to know in order to be able to conclude that Socrates is mortal from Socrates is human? Okay? And the answer, of course, is that I need the general rule that humans are mortal. And this is, in fact, how inverse deduction works. It's by, in some sense, filling in the blanks. I look at what I have in my data and the inferences that I would like to draw, which are also in my training data, and I figure out what are the missing rules. course, typically I wouldn't induce a rule like humans are mortal just from Socrates is human. I would also have Plato is human, or Aristotle is human, and so on and so forth. But that's the basic principle. And once I have these rules, I can then in the future combine them into potentially very complex chains of reasoning that are very different from anything that I have in the data. So this ability to compose pieces of knowledge on the fly is actually a very important one, and it's one that actually only the symbolists are able to do. Now, of course, in this example, the facts and the rules are written in English, and computers don't understand natural language. So in fact, this is these things are more likely represented in something like first-order logic, which the computer understands, but the principle is the same. And as I mentioned, of the 5 paradigms, this is the one that works most like scientists at work. And in fact, one of its most interesting applications is literally to automate science. So, for example, if you look at this picture, the biologist is actually not the guy in the lab coat. The guy in the lab coat is a computer scientist, a machine learning researcher by the name of Ross King. The biologist is actually the machine in the background. This machine is actually a complete robot biologist. It starts out with basic knowledge of biology, DNA, proteins, and so on, expressed in first-order logic, and then it uses inverse deduction to come up with hypotheses to explain the data that it's seeing. And one of the things that it has that you see in this picture is a DNA microarray. After it formulates the hypothesis, it actually designs the experiments to test them, and physically carries them out, and then refines the hypothesis and so on. So it goes through the entire loop of the scientific method on its own without any help from humans. Now the robot that's in this picture is called Eve. There's only one. There was one before that, called Adam. And a year ago, Eve discovered a new malaria drug that is now being tested. And if you think about it, once you have one robot scientist like this, there's nothing stopping you from making 1 million. And now science can make progress, a million times faster because these robots can work all day and all night discovering new knowledge. And in fields like biology, I think that's what it's going to take because there's so much knowledge to be discovered. Now, the connectionists are not big fans of this approach. They think that first-order logic is too rigid, and this sort of like high-level, abstract way of learning, really like a logician or a mathematician or a scientist would work, is not. There's a lot more going on under the hood that this doesn't take into account. So their approach is to reverse engineer the brain, since after all, if you can learn as well as the brain learns, you're in very good shape. And the leader of the connectionists is Jeff Hinton. He's been working for 40 years on the problem of understanding how the brain works. He started out in the 70s. He was originally a psychologist, and now these days he's more of a computer scientist. And he's really determined to figure out how the brain learns. In fact, he says that one day he came home from work very excited, saying, "I've done it. I figured out how the brain works." And his daughter replied, "Oh, Dad, not again." So he says that he's had some ups and downs, but definitely a lot of successes. And these days, under the name of deep learning or also neural networks, connectionism is very popular indeed. And 2 other prominent connectionists are Yann LeCun and Yoshua Bengio. So how are we going to reverse engineer the brain? Well, let's look inside the skull with a microscope and see what's there. And what's there is a bunch of neurons, right? A neuron is a very interesting type of cell, right? It looks a little bit like a tree. The trunk of the tree is called the axon, and the branches are called dendrites. And then those branches actually connect with the roots of other cells. And the connection is called a synapse. And to the best of our knowledge of biology, everything that you know is represented by the strengths of your synapses. So if the 2 neurons fire together, the synapse gets stronger and it becomes easier for the first neuron to fire the second, right? And what happens is that each neuron basically accumulates charge from the neurons that are, discharging it into the synapse. That's a chemical process that we needn't go into. And if the charge in the neuron passes a certain threshold, then it fires an electric discharge down the axon called an action potential, and that in turn may fire other neurons. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is, number one, we're going to build the simplest mathematical model of this that we can, that is still able to, function, to do these inferences and to learn. And then we will connect them into a large network, and then we'll figure out how to learn the weights. So here's a very simple model of what we just saw. What the neuron does is essentially just a weighted combination of its inputs. So each input is multiplied by a weight, which represents the strength of the synapse. And then if that weighted sum exceeds the threshold, then the output is 1, meaning the neuron is firing. Otherwise, it's 0, meaning the neuron is not firing. But now, of course, the big question is, what do you do when you put together a big network of these neurons? If you think about it, it's not obvious at all what you should do. So, for example, suppose that the input is here x1, x2, and so on, and the output is y. And suppose that the input is, for example, a picture of a cat, so each xi is a pixel, and the neuron and the network is supposed to output 1 because it is a cat. Well, if it is a cat and it is outputting 1, then nothing needs to happen. So don't go messing with what ain't broke. But if the output is, for example, 0.2, right, then it needs to go up by 0.8. And now, if you think about a neuron in the middle of the network and its weights, it's not at all clear what should change, right? How much is each weight responsible for the output, right? So there's this big problem of what is called credit assignment, right? Where do you assign the credit for the results, or maybe more accurately, the blame, right? Who needs to change and by how much when there's an error? And backpropagation is precisely a solution to this problem. And the idea in backpropagation is that we're going to start by measuring the error at the output. That's the delta. So, for example, if the output should be 1 and it's really 0.2, then the error is 0.8. And then we're going to use calculus to see how that error varies with each of the weights coming into that neuron. And then in return from that, we're going to see how much effective error is coming from the previous neurons. Those are the deltas. So, for example, a neuron that is positive, that has a positive output but has a negative weight, right, is actually preventing the output from firing. So actually, the weight of that neuron should go down. And we keep on doing this backwards, one layer after another, until we reach the input. So we're propagating the errors back and adjusting the weights accordingly. And that's essentially how backpropagation works, right? At the end of the day, it's really just the chain rule of calculus. We figure out what is the derivative of the error with respect to each of the weights, and then we change the weights to make the error go down. And as I mentioned, backpropagation. So backpropagation is the engine that drives deep learning. And these days, deep learning is used for just about everything. It's used for search. It's used for ad placement. It's used for image and video recognition. It's used for speech recognition. It's what Skype uses when it does simultaneous translation. So, for example, you speak in English and somebody on the other end hears you in real time in Chinese or another language. But perhaps the most famous deep network to date is the one that was on the front page of the New York Times a few years ago, and has become colloquially known as the Google Cat Network. So this is a network. At the time, this was the biggest neural network ever built. It had on the order of 1 billion parameters, and it was trained to recognize objects by looking at a lot of YouTube videos. So perhaps it should have been called the couch potato network. In fact, Google Cat Network is a bit of a misnomer because it can recognize all sorts of other things besides cats, right? It can recognize dogs and humans and whatnot. But people really like to upload videos of their cats to YouTube, so that's the class that had the most data, and so that was the class that it learned best. Now, the evolutionaries, they say, well, the greatest learning algorithm on Earth isn't really the brain, it's evolution, because evolution made the brain and everything else as well. And the first person that really started pursuing this idea in earnest was John Holland, who actually passed away recently. Back in the 60s and 70s, people sometimes said that, genetic algorithms, as this field is also now, was, John and his students and their students. But then in the 80s, things exploded. John Koza developed a more sophisticated version called genetic programming, which we will see in a second. And Hod Lipson is one of the people doing interesting things with evolutionary computing these days, as we will also see shortly. So the basic idea in evolutionary learning is that we know roughly how evolution works. So we can create a program to mimic evolution, and then instead of evolving animals or plants, we're going to develop the artifacts that we want, like, for example, programs or electronic circuits or whatever we want. So how does this work? Well, at any given point in time, we have a population of individuals. Each one of them is described by a genome, which, of course, in real life is DNA, but in our case, it can just be, a string of bits, zeros and ones. So if you will, those are the genes. And then each individual is evaluated by seeing how well it does at the task that we want it to perform, right? So it's a little bit like selective breeding, if you will, right? If you're trying to grow, for example, a radio, you will see how well it works as a radio. And then the ones that do best, meaning the fittest individuals, they get to reproduce. So you will do crossover, between the genomes of a father and a mother organism. Same thing here. You will have a genome for the child that is a combination of part of the genome of one parent and part of the genome of the other parent. So you literally cross over the two bit strings, and then you mutate some random bits, again emulating what happens in real life, and also allowing us to combat local optima and do sort of like greedy search and so on. And then you have a new population. And if you repeat this loop enough times, you often wind up with things that work surprisingly well. In fact, the example that I just gave you of evolving circuits is actually a real one, and the evolutionaries have actually taken up many patents for things like radios and amplifiers and low-pass filters and whatnot that were evolved by genetic algorithms. And often they work quite differently from the ones that are designed by engineers, and often they actually work better. Now, one thing that might come to your mind when you see this is, well, a bit string is a very low-level representation if what we want to do is learn a program, right? And crossing things over at a random point might easily muck up what would actually be a good program. So John Koza's idea was to say, well, actually, let's just represent programs as programs. And that led to the field of genetic programming. So the idea here is that a program is essentially a tree of subroutine calls, all the way down to simple operations like addition, multiplication, and so on. So let's represent the programs as trees, and then in order to do crossover, what we're going to do is we're going to pick a random node in each tree, and then we're going to swap the subtrees that are hanging from those nodes. So for example, in this diagram, if you pick the crossover point that I'm showing, one of the trees that you will wind up with is the tree with all the white nodes. And this tree actually represents a formula, which is one of Kepler's laws. It's the equation for the duration of a planet's year as a function of its average distance from the sun, right? It's c times d cubed, where c is the constant and d is the distance, and you see that this tree is actually computing that. And genetic programming can discover simple formulas like that, but it can also discover much, much more complex things. For example, robots have been, taught to play soccer using genetic programming, for example. And in fact, these days, one of the most interesting things that the evolutionaries are doing is no longer just simulating evolution on a computer, but actually doing it in the real physical world. So they're actually evolving robots. This little spider that you see here is actually a real robot from Hod Lipson's lab. And the way it works is that these things start out as, basically random piles of parts in simulation. Once they're good enough, they get manufactured, and then they start trying to, walk and crawl in the real world, as fast as they can, recovering from injuries, so on and so forth. And then in each generation, the best performing robots program a 3D printer to produce the next generation of robots. And after a while, they're actually doing pretty well. So, if you fast forward this, maybe this is how Terminator is going to come about. Or maybe not, but I mean, of course, these robots so far are not ready to take over the world, but they've come a remarkably long way from the soup of parts that they started with. Let's look at the Bayesians now. So Bayesians, they have their roots in statistics, but within computer science, the most famous Bayesian is probably Huda Pearl. He invented Bayesian networks, which is a very powerful type of Bayesian model, where each variable is a node and edges between the variables in the graph represent dependencies. He actually won the Turing Award for this a few years ago. Two other prominent Bayesians are David Heckerman and Mike Jordan. And Bayesians are known in machine learning as the most fanatical of the five tribes. And part of why they are so dedicated to their paradigm is that in statistics, Bayesians were a persecuted minority for 200 years, so they had to get pretty hardcore in order to survive. And it's a good thing they did, because they've contributed a lot to machine learning. And in fact, even within statistics these days, with more powerful computers and data and whatnot, Bayesians are actually on the ascendant. So what is Bayesian learning all about? Well, as I mentioned, Bayesians are above all concerned with uncertainty, and the way you compute the probability of your hypothesis is using Bayes' theorem. And in fact, Bayesians like Bayes' theorem so much that there was a Bayesian learning startup that actually had the big neon sign of Bayes' theorem made, and they put it outside their offices, and it's what you're seeing here. So, so how does this all work? Without getting into the gory details, Bayes' theorem is actually an extraordinarily simple thing, almost not worth being called a theorem if it wasn't so important. And the idea is like this. I have a bunch of hypotheses, all the things that might be true about the world, all the different ways of explaining my data. I'm going to start out with my prior belief in each hypothesis. This is how much I believe in it before I even see any data. And it's also, by the way, one of the things that makes Bayesianism controversial, because a lot of people say, well, you really, can't just make up hypotheses, make up, numbers like that. The Bayesian reply to that is, you are making them up explicitly or implicitly one way or another, so you might as well be explicit about it. So you start out with the prior probability of each hypothesis, and then what happens is that as you see evidence, you're going to update your belief in each hypothesis. And the way you update it is actually similar to what traditional frequency statisticians use, which is likelihood, right? And the idea is, if my hypothesis makes the evidence that I'm seeing likely, then conversely, the evidence also makes the hypothesis likely. So the more likely the evidence is given my hypothesis, the more likely the hypothesis is going to become. And by multiplying the prior and the likelihood, I'm going to get my posterior probability. And the posterior probability evolves as I see more evidence. Hopefully, I will end up with one hypothesis that is more likely than all the others. And usually most hypotheses will end up with very, very low probability. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, you can't avoid entertaining multiple hypotheses. There's also this quantity called the marginal, which you need to use in order to just make the probability sum to 1, but let's not worry about it. Now, what makes Bayesian learning hard is when the hypothesis spaces that you're looking at are very large. So the hypothesis space could be the space of Bayesian networks. And now computing all these things efficiently can become quite tricky, but Bayesians have come up with many very clever ways to do this inference very fast. And Bayesian learning has been applied in a lot of areas. For example, self-driving cars, one of the main ways that they learn is by using Bayesian inference. So next time you get in a self-driving car, remember that its brain is at least partly Bayesian. But one application of Bayesian learning that we are all familiar with is spam filtering. This was actually David Heckerman's idea to apply machine learning, and in particular Bayesian learning, to spam filtering. And these days, of course, it's very widespread. There are many other methods used to do spam filtering, but Bayesian learning was the first one, and it's still one of the most common. The hypothesis here is that the email that this email that you just got is spam or is not spam. So it has some prior probability, like the prior probability of something being spam is 90% or 99% or whatever. And then the evidence is things like the words in the email. So for example, if the email contains the word Viagra, that makes it more likely to be spam. If it contains the word free in all capitals, that makes it even more likely to be spam. And if it contains four exclamation marks, that increases the probability of spam even more. On the other hand, if the signature line contains the name of your best friend, then that makes it less likely to be spam. Okay? And at the end of the day, you have a posterior probability that the email is spam, and then the system can decide to reject or accept the email based on that probability. Okay, finally, let's look at the analogizers. This is actually a less cohesive tribe. It's more of like a loose agglomeration of people who all do learning based on this idea of reasoning by similarity. One of the pioneers in this area was Peter Hart. He did a very famous analysis of the nearest neighbor algorithm, which we will see shortly. Vladimir Vapnik is the inventor of kernel machines. These are both very simple analogy-based methods, but also more powerful ones that people, for example, from psychology have developed. One of those people is Douglas Hofstadter, who is also famous as the author of Gödel-Escher-Bach, which itself is an extended analogy between Gödel's theorem and the music of Bach and the art of Escher. His most recent book is actually 500 pages arguing that everything about thought and learning and intelligence boils down to analogy. So he really believes that analogy is the master algorithm. And he also coined the term analogizer, by the way. So how does learning by analogy work? Well, let me explain this by posing a very simple puzzle. And here's the puzzle. Let's suppose I give you a map of two countries, which I'm calling Pozistan and Negaland, and I just tell you where the main cities are. So the main cities in Pozistan are the plus signs here, and the main cities in Negaland are the minus signs. And the question, the puzzle is, where is the border between the two countries? Now, you can't know for sure where it is, right, because the cities alone don't determine it. But a pretty good heuristic is to say, well, I'm going to assume that a point on the map is in Pozistan if it's closer to a positive city, to some positive city, than to any negative one. Okay? And the effect of this is to break up the map into these metro areas, into these regions that are in some sense controlled by the different cities. So each of these polygons, the inside of it is the points that are closer to the corresponding city than to all the others. Okay? And in this way, I now can assign every point to positive or negative. And of course, instead of being a map, this could be a very high-dimensional problem. It could be a medical diagnosis problem. It could be an image. It could be you could be doing object recognition, whatever you want. And this, in essence, is the nearest neighbor algorithm, which, despite its simplicity and the fact that it's very fast at learning time, you actually don't do anything. You just remember the data. It's an O of 0 algorithm, if you will. It can actually get, in particular, if you use k neighbors and average them instead of just one, it can, given enough data, learn as well as the best conceivable learner, meaning its error will just be the noise level. So a surprisingly powerful algorithm. Now, it has a couple of disadvantages. One is that this frontier is pretty jagged, and the real one is probably smoother. Another one is, if you think about it, some of these examples are actually not necessary. So if you look, for example, at the positive example on the lower left corner, that city could be thrown away, and the frontier wouldn't change, because its area would be taken over by other positive cities. So in fact, the only points that you need are the ones that determine where the frontier is, the so-called support vectors, because they support the frontier, and in general, they're vectors. And so what support vector machines do is they throw away all the examples that aren't necessary to define the frontier. And of course, on a small example like this, that might not seem like a big deal, but if you have millions of examples, then it can make a big difference. And it also lets us learn a smoother frontier. It does that by solving the following problem. How can I walk from the bottom of this map to the top while keeping all the positive examples on one side and all the negative examples on the other, and staying as far as possible from every one of them as I can, right? So I don't just want a curve that passes in between the examples. I want them to stay as far away from them as we can, right? Think of them as landmines, right? You're walking through the no man's land, and you don't want to step on the landmine, so you want to maximize your margin of safety, and that's exactly what kernel machines do. Is they maximize the margin. And until deep learning had its big revival in the last several years, kernel machines were probably the dominant machine learning algorithm. And more generally, these analogy-based methods have been used for all sorts of things. Let me just give one example that we're all familiar with, and this is recommender systems. Things like Netflix recommending you movies, Amazon recommending you books. Every e-commerce merchant worth its salt, has a recommender system. And the way they typically work is by doing what's called collaborative filtering. And this is, instead of trying to predict whether you're going to like a movie based on its properties, which is very difficult because taste is a complex and subtle thing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find people who have similar tastes to you. So, for example, if someone gave 5 stars to a lot of movies that you gave 5 stars to, and gave 1 star to a lot of movies that you gave 1 star to, then I infer that you guys have similar tastes. And now, if they have given 5 stars to a movie that you haven't seen, then I will recommend that movie because it's likely that you will like that movie as well. Okay? And this, if you think about it, is really just the nearest neighbor algorithm applied to the problem of predicting whether you will like a movie or not. And it works surprisingly well. And in fact, Netflix gets three quarters of the movies that people rent on Netflix come from the recommender system. So this is a really central part of their business. And for Amazon, it's a third. So a third of Amazon's sales come from their recommender system. And again, these days people use all sorts of learning algorithms for recommender systems. But nearest neighbor was the first one, and it's still one of the best ones, often in combination with others. So let me take a step back. Here's what we've seen, right? There are 5 major schools of thought in machine learning. Each one of them has a problem that it solves better than all the others, and it has a solution for that problem, which is its own general purpose algorithm or general purpose learner or master algorithm. The symbolists, the problem that they solve is learning composable knowledge, and they learn it using inverse deduction. The connectionists solve the problem of credit assignment using backpropagation. The evolutionaries are able to learn structure, right? The connectionists start with a fixed structure and just learn the weights. The evolutionaries can actually create that structure from scratch using genetic programming. The Bayesians know how to deal with uncertainty in a principled way using probabilistic inference and Bayes' theorem. And the analogizers can reason by similarity. And in particular, they can generalize to situations that are very different from the original ones. Like, for example, think of Niels Bohr proposing his theory of the atom by making an analogy between the atom and the solar system, right? He was learning from a single example, and he was learning, across very different problems. This is something that only the analogizers are able to do. And their most popular algorithm is kernel machines. Now, each of these problems is a real problem and an important one. What that means, however, is that none of these tribes really have the master algorithm. What we really need is a single algorithm that solves all 5 problems at the same time. We need, in some sense, a grand unified theory of machine learning in the same way that the standard model is the grand unified theory of physics, or the central dogma is the grand unified theory of biology. And I and many others have been working on this problem for a while, and we've actually made a lot of progress. We're not there by any means, but let me just give you a sense of what the state of the art is. So at the outset, you might think that it's very difficult to unify all these paradigms. In fact, some people even believe it's impossible. because the five universal learning algorithms look so different superficially. But despite their superficial differences, they're actually quite similar at a certain level. They are all composed of the same three things: representation, evaluation, and optimization. And so if we can unify each of those, then we've unified the five paradigms. So let's start by looking at representation. Representation is how the learner is the language in which the learner represents what it's learned. For example, if it learned a program, the language could be Java or C++, although people don't typically use those because they're overly complicated. Or, if it's learning a model, it could be in the form of equations, differential equations or linear equations or what have you. And the representation that the symbolists use, as I mentioned, is typically first-order logic or variances it. The Bayesians use representations like Bayesian networks, Markov networks, which are collectively known as graphical models. And this representation already unifies a lot of different types of probabilistic models that we could use. So if we can unify graphical models and first-order logic, we're actually, we're making very good progress. And in fact, this has been done in a number of ways to date. The most popular one is Markov logic networks. Markov logic networks, all they do is they attach weights to formulas in first-order logic. So if you have a formula and you strongly believe in it, think of just, for example, a simple if-then rule or something that you believe is true of the world, like, humans are mortal. If you strongly believe in it, you give it a high weight. If you're not very sure, you give it a lower weight. And then this defines a Markov network, meaning a probability distribution where a state of the world is probable if a lot of rules with high weights are true in it, and vice versa. And with this, we can actually represent, with this form of probabilistic logic, we can actually represent pretty much anything that we might want to represent in machine learning. So that's, an approach to the representation aspect of learning that uses the symbolist and Bayesian paradigms. Now, the next part is evaluation. So evaluation is a scoring function that tells you how well a candidate model is. Okay? How well it fits the data, how simple it is, other desirable properties. And one thing that we can, naturally use for evaluation is posterior probability, which again, has as its instances things like, squared error in regression, also accuracy, error rate, things like that. But more generally, the evaluation function should actually not be a part of the learner. It should actually be provided by the user, right? You as the user should tell the learner what it is that it's supposed to be optimizing, right? If you're a company and your goal is to maximize profits, well, then that should be the evaluation function. If you're a consumer and your goal is to be happy, then what should be maximized is some measure of your happiness with with what you're doing or what you're buying or whatever. And so what the algorithm should be able to do is to take in that user-defined objective function and then optimize it, which brings us to the final part, which is optimization. Optimization is the search process by which I find the program or the model that is best according to my evaluation function. And if what we're using is probabilistic logic in the form of weighted formulas, there is now a very natural combination of ideas from the evolutionaries and the connectionists, which is we can use genetic programming to discover formulas, right? So formula first-order logic is really a tree of ands and ors and negations and whatnot. And so I can use crossover and mutation to evolve formulas. And then once I have those formulas, right, they constitute this big graph of inferences that you can make. And to learn the weights on the formulas, I can, of course, use backpropagation. So we're actually, well on the way to optimizing all the five paradigms. And there are some people that believe that, once we have that, we're done, right? We have, in some sense, a learner that can do anything. I'm a little skeptical of that. I think that even after we, unify all these things, there are probably still some, important ideas that we haven't had yet. and that we need to have in order to really have a universal, a general purpose learner. And I think those ideas, in fact, may not come from people who are already professional machine learning researchers, because we tend to, think along the tracks of the particular tribe that we belong to. These ideas, quite likely, I think, come from people who are actually, outside the field. And so, if you have any such ideas, please let me know so I can publish them. So let me just conclude by mentioning some of the things that we don't have today, but that I think we will have if we can create such a universal learner. The first one is home robots. We will all love to have robots that, cook dinner for us and do the dishes and make the beds and whatnot. But the reason we don't have them today, or at least one reason, is that, well, first of all, you can't build a home robot without machine learning. But second of all, a home robot, in the course of its day, runs into all the 5 problems that we've seen multiple times. So it needs, the 5 paradigms in order to solve them. But if we just try to kind of hack it all together, we're going to die of complexity. Another important one is, the kinds of projects that all the major IT companies have of turning the World Wide Web into a knowledge base. The best known one is probably Google's knowledge graph, but there are many others, and also similar projects in academia. The goal here is to have a computer, answer your questions instead of just retrieving web pages based on queries. In order to do that, it needs to represent the knowledge in something like first-order logic, but then the knowledge, of course, coming from the web is very messy and inconsistent and incomplete, so you need probability. So again, we're going to need all those 5 paradigms in order to solve this problem. Here's maybe the biggest one of all of these, which is curing cancer. Right? Machine learning algorithms are actually quite good at doing diagnosis in a lot of different areas, but cancer is harder. The reason cancer is hard is that cancer is not one disease. Everybody's cancer is different, and the same tumor changes as it goes along. So it's unlikely that there will ever be a single drug that cures cancer. What a lot of researchers are increasingly concluding is that what we're going to need to cure cancer is something like a machine learning system that learns to predict what is the right drug for this patient's cancer based on the patient's genome, her medical history, the mutations that the tumor has, and so on. In some ways, not too different from a recommender system, except that what's being recommended is a drug instead of a movie or a book. And of course, the problem is much harder, right? We need to understand how cells work. We need, and again, all the 5 paradigms are going to come into play here. Finally, apropos of recommenders, let me mention one application that I think is going to impact our lives very much, and this is the following. What we have today, which is different recommender systems to recommend different things for you based on different slivers of the data that you generate. Like, so for example, Netflix recommends movies, based on what you did on their site, and Facebook chooses updates and so on and so forth. This is really far from ideal. What I'd really like to have is a recommender system that learns from all the data that I've ever generated and recommends everything for me. Not just movies and books, but jobs, dates, houses, vacations, everything at every stage of your life. As Anish Chopra, the former CTO of the US, put it, if we use all our technology resources, we could actually give people personalized recommendations for every step of your life. And this, I think, is a glimpse of where machine learning is going. But it's also a challenge to us in machine learning to come up with the algorithms that will make it possible, because we don't have them yet. More about all of these things in my book, The Master Algorithm. This is a book about machine learning for a general audience. It's not a textbook. It doesn't have math in it. It's something that just describes the major concepts in machine learning and the history of the field, and also what some of its implications are. And you can learn more about all the things that I've talked about here in this book. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you, and I will take questions.
Oh, thank you, Pedro. Very interesting presentation. We have received a lot of questions, so let me read some of them. So first question is, what about deep learning? Do you consider it a paradigm, and is it a master algorithm?
Well, some of the connectionists certainly believe that deep learning is the master algorithm in the sense that look at all the different things it can learn, right? It's been scoring one success after another. It can do vision, it can do speech. Now they're using it, starting to use it for language, and they also want to use it for reasoning. And it's really all just backpropagation. So maybe by some standards, backpropagation is the master algorithm. I don't believe that to be the case because, as we saw, backpropagation does solve one very important problem, which is the creative assignment problem. But there are other problems like learning composable knowledge that it doesn't solve. So the symbolists will explain, and they did. There's this kind of a long-running argument. All the things about language and reasoning that you can't do with backprop or with multi-layered perceptrons or with existing neural networks. So I think it is going to take more than that. But the kind of success that we are seeing with deep learning today is, I think, an exciting preview of what will happen when we really do arrive at the master algorithm.
Okay, here is the second question. Is there any way of proving a completeness cover of all possible machine learning algorithms, meaning that there will be no six machine learning family of algorithms?
Yeah, so one answer to this is that each of the master algorithms of the 5 tribes has a theorem that says I can learn anything using this algorithm, in principle, given enough data. So, for example, even nearest neighbor, right, has a theorem that says if you give enough data, it will learn any function, meaning any input-output mapping. Okay. The problem is that the amount of data that you might need to do that could actually be, way beyond what even big data can give us. So the more practical question is, can we do this with a realistic amount of data and computation? And another question becomes, well, how many mechanisms will we actually need in order to do that? If it's 5 or 6, we're actually in good shape, right? My guess is actually these 5 that people have proposed are not going to be enough, and we're going to need different ones. And in fact, I think an interesting question is, how complex will this algorithm be? Will it be 1,000 lines of code? Will it be 1 million? It'll probably be more than 1,000, but hopefully it will be less than 1 million. But only time will tell.
Thank you. Here is another question. What would be the impact of machine learning capabilities or support new computing chips technologies such as NVIDIA Tesla M40, NVIDIA Jackson TX1, Qualcomm Zeros technology, IBM True North neuromorphic chips, etc. So how will they impact machine learning?
Yeah, well, we started out doing machine learning on ordinary CPUs because CPUs can do anything, right? And recently, a lot of it has been happening with GPUs. I think that's what's going to happen at the end of the day is that there are going to be chips developed and mass-produced specifically for the purpose of doing machine learning, right? Once we're able to tell the hardware and the architecture people what it is that we need in order to do learning, they will make it for us. And because, there's so much learning being done today, there will be a huge market for that. And, as an example, right, of what might happen, I can imagine having hybrid analog digital chips, right? Transistors, right, they implement an S-curve just like a neuron does, but then we only use them, in switching mode 0, 1, or in linear mode in analog circuits. It's actually odd, right? So I think, one of the things that we might see, and there are people working on all of these things, is chips that actually work more in the full range of what the electronics allows. And I can also imagine very different technologies at the end of the day being used for machine learning, beyond the traditional semiconductors that we have today. So it'll be very interesting to see, where things are, say, 10 years from now.
Speaking of 5 to 10 years from now, here is an interesting question. What is the impact of quantum computing on machine learning?
Well, if quantum computing succeeds, right, this is an open question, right? But let's just for a moment suppose that we had a good quantum computer. This would have an absolutely revolutionary effect on machine learning because it will allow us to solve problems exponentially quicker, right? In fact, there is one type of quantum computing that is particularly suited to machine learning, which is what D-Wave does, right? They have this so-called adiabatic quantum computing, and what it really does is it's finding the optimum, the global minimum of a function, which is exactly the kind of optimization problem that we have to solve in machine learning, but it uses the quantum tunneling effect to actually jump from local minima to eventually the global one. So this is a very controversial technology. Some people say that it's not really doing what it's doing, right? They have these computers that they sell for a lot of money. But if that comes to pass, what it means is that we would, in reasonable time, be able to literally find the global optimum of the evaluation functions in our learning algorithms. And I would love to have that. So I hope it comes to pass.
Okay, well, until then, here is a more practical question. What about ensemble models? Can they enable us using all of those paradigms?
Yes, so I think ensemble models are one of the most important developments in machine learning in the last 20 years, right? If there's one lesson that we have now learned very well is, don't just throw one learner at your problem, throw all of them and throw many variations of all of them and then combine it all, right? And, there are all these methods like stacking and boosting and random forest and whatnot, and they really work. So in some ways, you could even say, and some people say that, well, you already have the master algorithm, it's model ensembles. However, model ensembles have a number of limitations, right? One is that, they actually don't do anything that any of the, individual pieces, didn't do, right? They, in some sense, just, combining them, combining those individual pieces. And the way they combine them is very crude, right? They just take them as black boxes. As a result of which, sort of like the deeper integration that we would really like to have is not provided by the model ensembles. One consequence of that is that they are, maybe a lot less efficient than a better master algorithm would be, right? Because they're doing all this work that perhaps could be done, by an algorithm that integrated things more deeply, and maybe they're not able to learn things that otherwise we would be able to learn. And also there's the resulting model is extremely complex, right? A model ensemble is very hard to interpret, and we would like to have an algorithm that we understand better. So I think there's a lot of reasons why model ensembles by themselves are not the master algorithm, but in some ways, with today's state of the art, they're one of the closest to it that we have.
Okay, well, I think we have time maybe for one more question. So will a 360-degree recommender that you mentioned affect the decision-making capability of humans? Will it be symbiotic relationship of man and machine, or will we become slaves to those recommender algorithms?
Well, it's the other way around, right? It's not. I don't think it's a symbiotic relationship, and we are definitely not going to become slaves to the machines because the 360 recommender is just an extension of you, right? All the 360-degree recommender is doing all the things that you would if you had the time, right? So you have a million books to choose from. You don't have time to look at all of them. What the recommender system does is it filters out 99% of them, and then you just have a number of options that you can actually work with. And it's continuously learning to try and choose the things that you would choose, right? So you should just think of it as kind of like what some people call, an exocortex, right? It's an extension of your brain. It makes you more powerful. It's like a little bit like having, computers give you better memory, or more memory. Cars let you, move faster. This thing will let you make choices and adapt the world, in a way that you can't today, right? There is, I think, one very important caveat in all of this, which is it is important that 360-degree recommender be under your control and nobody else's, right? There are, many companies trying to build, this 360-degree recommender by one name or another, including, Apple and Google and Microsoft and, Facebook and whatnot. But the problem at the end of the day is that, they have a conflict of interest, right? They also want to make money. So I think part of what we need for this to happen is, the data to come together, better learning algorithms to make it happen. But we also need to make sure that one way or another, we have a structure where you are the owner of your data and your model and not somebody else. Without that, I think, people might not want to have it.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Pedro, for a very interesting presentation. And there are many more questions that, if Pedro has time, he can answer online. So thank you all for attending this ACM webinar. And here some links where the learning can continue. You can send the questions about this webcast to learning@acm.org. You can check ACM Learning webinars on demand at learning.acm.org webinar. You can join ACM SIGKDD to participate in data mining and machine learning community and read ACMQ. And this webinar will be recorded and you will all receive a link to the webinar. So thank you all for attending. And thank you very much, Pedro, for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.